How do you define a rogue state? A quick search on Google produces the following handy definition: a nation or state regarded as breaking international law and posing a threat to the security of other nations. That seems like a perfectly reasonable definition to me. Now, normally the term rogue state is only bandied around to mean states deemed hostile to Western interests. I mean, Israel is a Western ally. It's also an egregious and systematic violator of international law, but you don't hear it being called a rogue state, generally speaking, do you? If you leave aside Israel's genocidal onslaught against Gaza, you have the occupation, of course, of the West Bank, the longest belligerent occupation in modern history, and the colonisation of this Palestinian land. Now, the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, recently made clear that this represented systematic violations of international law. But what of the United States itself, the world's only hegemon, albeit a power in decline? Its position's been very clear for a long time. International law for the United States is a bit like a buffet. You pick and choose as it suits you. If it's useful at any given moment to take action against a hostile state, very convenient. Otherwise, it's to be ignored. International law is for thee, not for me. Now, the response to the International Criminal Court is instructive. Unlike most of the world's states, the US refuses to be a signatory because it knows full well that it is guilty of multiple infractions of international law, including repeated war crimes, including, for example, the illegal war of aggression that was the catastrophic invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, the US response to the ICC's belated decision to issue arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant has all the hallmarks of the behaviour of a rogue state. Let's start with the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham.
So to any ally, Canada, Britain, Germany, France, if you try to help the ICC, we're going to sanction you.
Well, that means I want every ally, and you saw little Justin in Canada and his position. What should the penalty be?
We should crush your economy because we're next. Why can't...
In this case, he's openly declaring the Republican administration would crush the economy of US allies if they abided by their legal responsibilities as signatories to the International Criminal Court after it issued arrest warrants based on overwhelming evidence, which went, of course, through the chief prosecutor, an independent panel of eminent lawyers, the 3 pre-trial judges from different countries. What he says is striking, that the US would need to crush the economy of, say, Canada or Britain, because otherwise we are next. Here's the fear clearly expressed: that a world order in which the US and its Western allies can act with impunity, as above the law, where they can't be held accountable, that this world order is crumbling. That maybe, just maybe, one day Western leaders won't be able to spread death, destruction and chaos in pursuit of their own perceived narrow interests without facing personal consequences. And that indeed, the gravity of Israel's genocide in Gaza is simply too extreme, too shameless to confess to, and that may not be just Israeli leaders one day issued with arrest warrants, but also the Western leaders who gave them weapons, as well as aid, as well as diplomatic cover, as well as political support. Now, back in May this year, before the requests for arrest warrants were submitted by the chief prosecutor, 12 Republican senators sent a threatening letter to him in which they said any warrant was not only a threat to Israel's sovereignty, but to the sovereignty of the United States, adding, "Target Israel and we will target you." It ended, "You have been warned." I mean, forget rogue states, that's a gangster state. That sounds like a gangster. That's how gangsters speak. And then just before the warrants were issued, the incoming Republican Senate Majority Leader declared the US must pass legislation threatening the ICC with sanctions if warrants were issued. The legislature in the US has already passed legislation cancelling the US visas of ICC officials and placing financial restrictions on court officials. Now, it's not just right-wing Republicans kicking off. The Washington Post purports, of course, to be a bastion of US liberalism. Its editorial board has issued its own stance, headlined, "The International Criminal Court is not the venue to hold Israel to account." The subheading, "The ICC is needed to help resolve war crimes in Russia, Sudan, Myanmar. Targeting Israel makes that harder." I mean, astonishing. I mean, talk about saying the quiet part out loud. The International Criminal Court is only supposed to be for Africans and Russians. It's not supposed to be people we consider as being like us. What's so wild about this is the following. Let's just listen to Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, being interviewed back in May, 6 months ago.
The dignity of the individual is the protection of babies. I mean, these are fundamental American values that should engender bipartisan support. Now, of course, this situation, unfortunately, lies on the San Andreas fault of international politics and strategic interests. And of course, I've had some elected leaders speak to me and be very blunt. This court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin, was what one senior leader told me. We don't view it like that. This court is the legacy of Nuremberg. This court is a sad indictment of humanity. This court should be the triumph of law over power and brute force. Grab what you can, take what you want, do what you will, and we're going to simply be, we're not going to be dissuaded by threats or any other activities, because in the end we have to fulfill our responsibilities as prosecutors, as the men and women of the office, as judges, as the registry.
So that's when he issued requests for arrest warrants. So Karim Khan rightly damns a Western leader, anonymously, we don't know who that Western leader was, who told him that the ICC was built for Africa and thugs like Putin. And then the Washington Post just literally comes out and says it. Now, this frankly deranged Washington Post editorial suggests the Israeli state can be trusted to investigate its own actions, which they can't bring themselves to say are war crimes and war crimes against humanity. I mean, they clearly don't believe that officially. Despite no meaningful evidence in Israel's history that they would actually take any meaningful action, not least against their leaders. I mean, this is a society currently in the midst of genocidal mania. It's just insulting nonsense, of course. Now, meanwhile, Biden's administration has come out and fiercely denounced the ICC arrest warrants, with Biden denouncing it as outrageous. Let's listen to his spokesperson, shall we?
We fundamentally reject the court's decision to issue arrest warrants for senior Israel officials. We remain deeply concerned by the prosecutor's rush to seek arrest warrants and the troubling process errors that led to this decision. The United States has been clear that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over this matter. You've heard us say this before. Whatever this prosecutor might imply, there is no evidence, none, between Israel and Hamas. There's just none. In coordination with partners, including Israel, we are discussing certainly those next steps, what that's going to look like. And to your question about sanctions, that's basically kind of just answered it in that last part of what I said. We're in consultation with our partners and also, which include Israel, about our next steps. We fundamentally reject that the ICC has jurisdiction over this situation.
What are you even talking about? Do you even know what you're talking about? Firstly, she talks about the prosecutor's rush to get arrest warrants. Now, firstly, the state of Palestine joined the ICC in 2015, years before Karim Khan was chief prosecutor. A preliminary investigation into alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in the East Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza began in 2015. Khan's predecessor announced in 2019 that the criteria for a full investigation was then met, but she said the question of jurisdiction wasn't settled. In 2021, the ICC pre-trial chamber voted to agree that the court did have jurisdiction, and so an investigation was then opened, again under his predecessor. This has been going on for years. As regards these specific horrors, which began after the 7th of October, it took 6 months of some of the most depraved atrocities being committed every single day in full view of the world before the chief prosecutor submitted his request for arrest warrants, which for good measure he submitted to a panel of esteemed lawyers for their approval. It then took another 6 months until the requests for arrest warrants were accepted by 3 pre-trial judges, way longer than it took in the case of Vladimir Putin over the invasion of Ukraine. Is that really a rush? What process errors is she talking about? Why is she going on about the prosecutor when this had to go through 3 pre-trial judges? She's behaving as a one-man expedition rather than a system. Now, she says the ICC has no jurisdiction over this matter. Total nonsense. The state of Palestine is a signatory to the ICC. Thereby, war crimes and crimes against humanity involving Palestine fall under its jurisdiction, as indeed the court found after lengthy deliberation and wrecking attempts from, for example, the British government. She says whatever this prosecutor might imply, there is no evidence between Israel and Hamas. There is just none. I presume she meant equivalence there. I'll let it slide. I mean, firstly, none of this is about equivalence. The question facing the court was, did both Hamas and the Israeli state commit war crimes and crimes against humanity on their own terms? It's not in the case of the law, you don't have a criminal system going, well, we'll only charge some people based on the gravity of what they've done, but we won't bother with anyone else because it might make it look like they're on the same level. I mean, the answer is yes, as far as the court is concerned, in terms of the burden of evidence. Hence, arrest warrants were issued for both. And if we're going to talk about the question of equivalence, I've been clear from the start, Hamas did commit grave war crimes on the 7th of October, for which there's no justification whatsoever. If we're talking about scale, let alone the inherent dynamics involved here, occupied, occupier, military superpower, guerrilla army, Israel has objectively committed far deadlier and more destructive war crimes on a much bigger scale for a much longer period of time. Those are just the facts, and facts are facts, I'm afraid. Now, Biden has apparently called Macron to tell him that Netanyahu was right to be angry since France had accepted or declared that it would implement the ICC arrest orders, that is, abiding by its legal obligations. That man's a joke, a pathetic joke, not a funny joke, a monster who'll go down in history as a war criminal for his involvement in this obscenity, using what remaining time he has in high office to lobby for Israel's right to be protected from accountability as it commits heinous atrocities. You can see why the US is threatened. This wasn't supposed to happen. These arrest warrants are a sign of a shift in the balance of power, albeit in a world still dominated by a thuggish superpower determined to destroy what remains of the international order to defend genocide. But the US is rattled, it's panicking, and despite the horrors to come under Donald Trump, the genie's out of the bowl, and what's more, they know it. Please like and subscribe, give your thoughts, your comments. Do help us take on the pro-genocide media at patreon.com/7jones84. We're about to do a big revamp. The channel will change its appearance and look more slick and professional. The plan is also to have a specific studio, which will look slick and professional. It takes time, but we're getting there. And there are other things to come as well. Not least in what I think is a number one priority, which is taking on the right across every medium on the internet, because they're doing pretty well there and it's having a big impact. We've got to do something about it. Listen to the podcast, share the video. I'll speak to you soon.